our deepest wounds are never healed overnight. They're healed in stages and in layers because it is the deepest wound for a reason, right? When you're digging a hole, you don't get to the bottom first. You're digging for treasure. It takes a while. You got to go through different layers of rock and sediment. Sometimes you got to let things soak. Sometimes you need a break. Hello, my loves. This is Johanna Burkhardt. I am a multidimensional channel, teacher, healer, and author. And I am obsessed with all things metaphysical, esoteric, galactic, and of course, the healing journey. And I'm here to share my stories, my wisdom, and my teachings about being human in the illusion that we call reality. Welcome to Cosmic Blonde. Hello, my loves. I've mentioned on this podcast several times that one of my biggest and deepest core wounds is my abandonment wound. And we heal the abandonment wound when we no longer abandon ourselves, when we choose ourselves instead of needing somebody to choose us. And I've had these weird moments over the last 2 weeks and this insane clarity and these heavy feelings all coming up because I have been confronted and faced with the family lineage of this wound, the karmic patterning that's been passed down from generations. And it's just a weird concept. It's a weird thing to look at. It's heavy to feel, and I don't know, it's just like it's just a surreal. I'm having a surreal moment. Today as I record this is my daughter's 27th birthday. The same daughter who is no contact with me. I haven't really talked about this because it's more of her story than it is mine to tell, but I can tell my side, and I know what it's like to want to go no contact with a mother. With my mother, I was no contact for quite some time. And I know what it's like to want that respected and honored. And I also know why I did it. Whereas with her, I struggle because I don't I don't feel that I understand fully why she's doing what she's doing. I have an inkling, but we've never been able to have the conversation. In a sense, I felt I was a little robbed of that conversation. And that's another story that I just am not going to dive into of why. But regardless, I felt since this was coming up for me today, I might as well talk about it because I'm sure it's going to resonate with a lot of people, because a lot of the people that I've been connecting to over the last couple of months, it's been a theme of women gravitating towards me who have their adult children going no contact with them and not understanding why. And it's a hard thing. It's hard for us to feel because we feel like we're not enough. We feel shame. We feel guilt. We feel like we're the problem, which is what shame is, right? Feeling like you're the problem, or guilt, meaning you've done something wrong. But in a lot of cases, we might not even know what it is that hurt our child or that made them feel that they needed to go no contact. I have an idea of what hers is, and I will talk about that. But I just wanted to have an open conversation about the abandonment wound, about the mother wound in general, because my abandonment wound is my mother wound. It's not feeling good enough. It's feeling like no matter what I do, it will never be enough. That I will constantly have to prove my worth, or nobody will stick around. And that's a horrible feeling for anybody who's had it. It's a horrible feeling. And our deepest wounds are never healed overnight. They're healed in stages and in layers because it is the deepest wound for a reason, right? when you're digging a hole, you don't get to the bottom first. You're digging for treasure. It takes a while. You got to go through different layers of rock and sediment. Sometimes you got to let things soak. Sometimes you need a break. So I wanted to just kind of talk about it because it's brought up a lot of feels being her birthday today, but I'm going to go back a little bit in time. And, Mother's Day has always been another day that's been hard for me, mainly because my mom left when I was 3. And I grew up with a single dad until I was about 10. And the time with my dad, just me and my dad, was some of the best times of my entire life. And I am so ridiculously blessed to have had that time, that 7 years where it was just me and my dad. It wasn't easy. And I was still doing things I shouldn't have been doing. I was still taking care of myself when I should have been being taken care of. I was acting like the woman of the house, but I also had a good childhood, and I also had friends, and I also had a dad who took me everywhere and rarely ever left me behind. And when he did, he left me with my grandmother, who was like my mother. And so those times are some of the happiest memories. And I don't have a lot of those memories. I was young, but they're good memories that I hold on to. But that mother wound got exacerbated when my stepmother came in around 10, between the ages around 10, 11. That's when she came into my life. And, she just was emotionally and mentally and soon physically abusive, and just exacerbated that mother wound. But one thing that I remember her telling me all the time was how my dad told her that my mom never wanted me, my real mom, that she never wanted me, that she wanted to get rid of me, meaning have an abortion, and my dad made her have me. And she always told me that. She drilled that into my head. You weren't wanted. You weren't wanted. And it's one thing to hear it from somebody who is legit the worst person on the planet. Anybody who is an abuser of a child, you are the worst person on the planet. It's one thing to hear that from her. And a part of me could always say, well, she's just an evil person, and I don't have to believe her. And part of me always knew that there was truth to it. I mean, I remember her even telling me at one point that my mom threw herself down a flight of stairs trying to lose me. And I still to this day don't know if that's true. It's a hard question to ask, and it doesn't really matter because I'm here, right? So Mother's Day, I had just gotten back into town. I wasn't with my kids. I had just left my kids. And I didn't spend it with my mother. We had agreed that the following week we would spend some time together when it wasn't busy, spend it on a different day. And so we did. I picked her up. We went kayaking on a local lake. And we happened to be talking about several different things around the topic of pregnancy and having babies and stuff. I'm not even sure how we got on the topic, but it doesn't really matter. We were kayaking, and she casually, totally casually, you guys, drops this. I never told you, but I wanted to abort you. And I even talked to my parents and considered giving you up for adoption. She said, I told your father I didn't want to be a mother, that I wouldn't be a good mother, and that I didn't want to have this baby. And he insisted that we have you. And so I said, I'll do my best. That's what she told me. Those are pretty much her words, almost verbatim. It does something to you when you hear it from the horse's mouth. And like I already knew that. I already knew all of those things. I didn't know that she considered putting me up for adoption. But I mean, it rings true because that's what my stepmom always told me, right? So she was right. My mom didn't want me. She did say she was glad she ended up having me, though I'm not sure why. And I think in that moment I was processing the fact that she admitted those things to me that I couldn't get the words out of my mouth. Like, why are you happy that you ended up having me? Why are you happy that you kept me? Because you were only there till I was 3. I did see her a handful of times between 3 and 16. They were not good visits, and it was never anything consistent. And after pretty much my stepmom came into the picture, it was non-existent. So I really am curious, and I don't know if I'll ever ask her that, but regardless, she thought, and what she said to me that day was that when she left when I was 3, she thought I was doing the best thing for me. She thought that I would have the best life with my father, that my dad would be able to give me a better life with her not in the picture. And I will say that I understand her thinking. I understand where she was. And honestly, she was the first example of choosing what it means to choose herself, right? She chose herself. She chose herself because she was drowning. In the 70s, it was very common for people to do drugs. And both my parents did a lot of drugs. They smoked weed, they did cocaine and crystal meth, they drank, they partied. And I'd love to say that after my mom left, that my dad stopped doing those things, but he didn't. The difference was is I never knew he was doing them. I knew he drank. He always had an open container in the vehicle. I knew he smoked pot. That was obvious. I mean, he grew them in the backyard. But I never saw him once snort cocaine or crystal or do any of that. He did a really good job of hiding that from me, though in hindsight, there are moments I look back in my childhood. I was the generation Gen X. We didn't come home until the street lights came on. That was our way of knowing it's time to come home. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have a system of knowing where the fuck your kids were, you know? So I remember there was a couple of times coming walking up the street and every light in the house was on. And my dad was tweaker cleaning. And you know what I mean when I say that, when you're just scrubbing every nook and cranny, right? And I was usually the one that cleaned up. I was the one that did those kinds of things. And so I remember thinking this is weird, but I didn't know what was going on. But hindsight and knowing what I know now, obviously that's what was happening. I just have to laugh because it's funny when you look back and you're like, oh, I get it now. So anyway, I would love to say that stopped. It didn't. My dad stopped doing drugs when my brother was born. My brother was born in 1990. And so that's when my dad stopped doing drugs. That's when my dad cleaned up his act. He never stopped drinking, but he did stop doing drugs. But it's too late. My stepmom was a drug addict and she did not get her life together. And after she had my brother, she went back to doing drugs. And I ended up becoming my brothers and my stepsisters got basically their partner, their parent, I should say, their person who took care of them because she sure as hell didn't do it. My mom never knew any of those things. My mom never knew that I was abused by this woman. My mom never knew all of these things were happening. And in fact, most people in my life did not. I know I was with a friend over the weekend who knew me back in high school, and she read my book and she kind of stopped at certain points because she felt like such a bad friend because she did not know what I was going through. And I literally just said to her, like, nobody did. I didn't tell anybody what was happening. I mean, there was I'd like to say there was people who knew, but I don't think there really was people who knew. I think there might have been times when I told people small things, but even the closest people to me, like my next door neighbor who was like a brother to me for a while, I mean, he didn't even really know the extent of what was going on. So who wants to admit that though? Nobody wanted, I mean, I didn't as a child. I wanted just to be a normal kid. I didn't want people to know that my parents did drugs or were alcoholics. I didn't want my friends to know that my house wasn't clean. I didn't want my friends to know that sometimes I didn't eat. I didn't want my friends to know that I was being abused. Like, who wants to? No, no. I didn't want people to feel sorry for me. I just didn't want that. I lived and created an imaginary world in my head, and I, I romanticized that. That's what you do and I have learned that when you don't have love in your life, you romanticize. You have to romanticize something where nothing exists. This is why I romanticize partners in my life, right? This is a childhood wound. It's why I romanticize and have blind hope sometimes with projects and just life in general. It's honestly romanticizing my life has kept me alive more times than I care to admit. But my mom never knew any of this until she read my book. And that's when things started to shift and change in our relationship. And then they would end up getting worse. And then they got a little better. And we're at a space now where I went about 6 months with no contact with her. I went 6 months with no contact with her. And I mean zero contact, no social media. I blocked her. I no text messages, no phone calls. She used to be on my 360 where she could follow where I was in the world when I was traveling. I blocked her from that. Like, I did not want her knowing anything about me whatsoever. Nothing about my life. And the reason why I chose to go no contact with my mother is, one, she has never been a mother. She's always been more of an acquaintance in my life after we reconnected when I was 16. And she has never been somebody who has been there for me in the way that I needed her to be, only in a way that was convenient for her. And anytime she's done anything for me, she has held it over my head for the rest of my, like, continuously. And if I don't do what she wants me to do, or if I didn't, you know, but take her advice, then she wasn't going to help me. And I just don't think that is helpful. And when I needed her the most, when I was struggling the most and like grasping, feeling like I'm at the bottom of a hole, grasping my hand up for a hand up. Please help me up. Please help me up. Please help me up. I'm struggling, Mom. I'm struggling, Mom. Her answer was, do these things and you will help yourself. And I said, those things, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. And she left me. She wouldn't help me. And instead of helping me, she said the most horrific things for me, to the point to where I downloaded the video that she sent and saved it to my Dropbox, because in case I ever wanted to remind myself of who she really was, I would have a video of it. Isn't that just horrible to say? But I do, I have it. She was never there for me. She abandoned me. She didn't want me. When I needed her the most, she continuously did not show up for me and would leave me and make me feel even worse. So in my eyes, that justified going no contact. You don't get to know about my life if you all you're going to do is judge it and ridicule it and shame me. No, I put up a boundary. And when she violated the boundaries, I went no contact, because that is how boundaries work. Boundaries are about you, not about controlling the other person. So I had to exit the relationship and say, no, I don't want to speak to you anymore. And last year, I decided to end the no contact and try again for I don't know how many times to mend the relationship and have some sort of relationship with her. And we're working on it. It's a work in progress. The boundaries are strong, and she has a lot more respect for me than she did before. And so with as long as she honors my boundaries and she shows respect, that's all that matters. But I don't ask her for anything. And I know that she's not anybody I could count on. But again, I want to say how difficult it was to hear those words in person from the horse's mouth. Like, it legit does something to you. And again, I understood where she was coming from, because again, she was the first one to show me. I kind of went off on a tangent, so I want to come back to this. What it means to choose yourself. When she left, she was trying to get away from the drugs. She was trying to get clean. I'd love to say that after she left, she got clean, just the way I said I wish I could say that my dad was clean, but she didn't. She did not get clean. She ended up moving in with her brother, who was a drug addict, and it just made it worse. And I don't know when she got clean. I know it was sometime in the mid 90s that she got clean and got her shit together. But the premise of her leaving was, you're going to have a better life, and I have to go get clean. I have to get my shit together. And it took her 10 years after leaving me to accomplish that. But the reason why she left was her trying to choose her, whether she was successful at that or not, right? She continued to abandon herself and poison herself. And that was her journey and her choice. And so I vowed never to do that to my kids. And I spent every waking moment of my life trying to give my kids everything that they needed and give them the very best life, the best that I knew how. I was 17 when I had my daughter. I was a baby having a baby, and I had already raised my brother and sister to the age of 5 and 7 when I chose to leave my house. The first time I chose me was when I left my siblings. When I was 16, I left home. And the reason I had stayed as long as I did to make it to 16 was because I was afraid that if I didn't, my siblings would starve to death. But once they hit those ages, I don't know. I do know what happened. That's in my book. I'm not going to talk about it here, but there was a catalyzing event that pushed me out the door, that made me choose me. First, basically at that point, I knew I had no choice but to go. And I knew that they would, I hoped that they would be okay. They were a little bit older. And so me raising her at 17, she saw a lot of things that she probably shouldn't have saw. I partied. I had a lot of fun, but I always kept her safe. She was never in danger. She had a roof over her head. She had everything she ever wanted. She was fed. She was clothed. She had medical insurance. She went to the doctor. She went to the dentist. I always made sure that she was prioritized and gave her a very good life. And same when my son came. I didn't always pick the best partners. And so, there was still trauma. There were still things that happened, but neither one of them were ever abused sexually, physically, mentally, or emotionally on my end. But when she was about to turn 16, I had made a decision that I was going to move to North Carolina. I had met a man. I really honestly was running from my life, and I can just straight up admit it. I was running from my life. I no longer wanted to be enabling my father, who was still heavily drinking. I didn't want to be his enabler anymore. It was really hard for me to say no. And so the easiest thing was for me to leave. I struggled with leaving my dad and my grandmother. That was the reason why I always stayed. I had thought about leaving the state and the area that we call East County many, many times. So when I met this man, it was like, oh, this is my out. This is my chance to have a normal life, living in the country, raise my son where he can run the streets and the way that we used to and not have to worry about drugs and crime. And I was wrong about that one too, but it's a whole nother story. And so my daughter was of age where I could, ask her, do you want to come with me? Because what she tells the judge is going to go, once you're over 12, what you tell the judge, unless there's some type of severe abandonment or neglect going on or abuse, the judge is always going to rule in the child's favor. And I knew that if she said no, there was no point of trying to get custody of her in a move order. She was in the middle of high school, and I knew there was a good chance she wasn't going to go, but she was a mama's girl more than she was a daddy's girl. When she was supposed to be at her father's house because we went week on, week off, she would lie and say she was at her friend's house and she would come to my house. She was always attached to me, even as a little child. In order to go to the grocery store, her dad had to take her into her bedroom and play with her and distract her so I could leave. Otherwise, she'd cry and freak out. She was always a mama's girl. So I knew this wasn't going to be easy for either one of us. But when she said she didn't want to go, it was really hard, but I chose to still go anyway. And that meant that she was going to live with her father full time. And her father lived with his mother. So it was going to, she was going to be in good hands. Her grandmother always took really good care of her, more so than her father did. But this is where she deems that I abandoned her. And physically, I can understand that. Physically, I can understand that I was not physically there for her and that I altered her life and it was traumatic for her. I cannot take away that experience for her. Her feelings are valid. Her perception is valid 100%. And I have apologized to her a million times. It will never be enough for her. And that's okay. Again, her feelings are valid. I will never discredit them. But emotionally and mentally and financially, I was still there for her. We talked all the time. I always listened to her. Anything she needed, I always got the money for and sent it to her and paid for it and took care of it. I always made sure she did not go without. And she had some, I'm not going to go into her story, but this is the basis of why she ended up going no contact, what I'm about to say. So we went through our process, right? A couple years later, she ended up moving to North Carolina to be with me after she graduated. And not just to be with me, but to be with my dad because my dad was dying. And so she came and she ended up staying. And she ended up finally liking my husband and, she stayed in the area. When my son was 15, I asked my husband for a divorce. And I moved out and I moved down the street. And I was down the street for almost 2 years. And I saw my son once a week, sometimes more, but because I went to him, he didn't want to stay at my place. He was very comfortable in his room. He was very introverted. He had a life. He had things. He's a teenager, but he was fine. He didn't feel abandoned by me. He was a happy kid. He had a good life. And me and his dad get along. We were still very close as a family. We still did all family things together and still do to this day. Where everything changed was when I decided to become a nomad. And you all know, if you've listened to this podcast, why I became a nomad. But when I left North Carolina, I knew it was going to trigger everything in her. And I need to go back actually, because I need to make a correction. 2024, he was 13 when I asked for the divorce. He was 15 when I became a nomad. So when I knew when I left to become a nomad, it was going to trigger her abandonment wound. because in her eyes, I was now abandoning my son, her brother, at the same time that I quote unquote abandoned her. And so it's a pattern, right? You can clearly see the pattern. My mom abandoned me, and now I'm essentially abandoning my kids. And while I will stand behind the fact that I did not abandon them, I, again, was not living physically with my son, but I came back to see my son every 3 months. I drove or flew into town every three to 4 months. Anything he needed, he was taken care of. His father was taking care of him. I was taking care of him. We talked constantly. I was there for him in all other ways. I just physically wasn't there to drive him around, to be his chauffeur, to be his maid, to be the motherly things of being a mom in the household. And she still lived with and still does, lives with my ex. And she has always been somebody who kind of stepped into that motherly role with her brother, even at a very young age. When Austin was born, she always was trying to help take care of him. They have a kinship that only they understand. And she was never asked to help do the motherly things for her brother. He has a father who is more than capable of doing those things. It's something she chose. But she blames me. She blames me because I wasn't there. And so she feels like she had no choice but to do so. And that was her reason for going no contact. And so, again, I understand her perception, but it's also colored by the lens of her wounds, right? Because we always see things how we are, not as they are. And that's really important to understand. So she sees them as she is through the wound of abandonment. And that I can relate to because I see a lot of things through the wound of abandonment. So how you see things is because of how you are, not because that's how they are, right? It's colored, your reality and your perception of your reality is colored by your wounds, your beliefs, your trauma. The only thing that I could do is respect her choice and to be as respectful as I can and to once again apologize for anything without needing to defend myself or prove that I was a good mom, because I know I was a good mom. And I know I broke a lot of the patterns that happened to me. I broke the chain of abuse. I broke the chain of a lot of things. But this wound runs through the female line of my family. And I think one of the reasons why I wanted to share this is because when we look at the patterning of our parents and their parents and how we are and what we've done with our kids, we can see a pattern, especially when it comes to your core wound, right? And so understanding that, you can then see how you show up in romantic relationships, especially romantic. You can sometimes see this in friendships, but it's easiest to see your childhood wounds through a romantic partner, because those are the people that you let into a different version of yourself. Like you let them in at a different level than you do even your best friend. So it's different. And so I was able to see my childhood patterning. And I think I've talked about my patterns on another episode, but I was able to see my pattern through my relationships and see how that was a pattern that was set up in childhood. And then listening to my mom, her mom and dad were married until my grandmother died. And they stayed together, even though my grandfather cheated. He was in the military. When he went overseas, his ring came off. It was a well-known thing. A lot of men did it back in the day. But her childhood was shitty in its own sense. They didn't go on vacations. Her parents didn't listen to her. Her parents didn't choose her. Her parents didn't prioritize her. She has a lot of wounding when it comes to her parents. And so in a way, they abandoned her in a different way. They abandoned her when she needed them the most. When she needed emotional support, they abandoned her. When she needed physical support, they abandoned her. They weren't there for her the same way they were there for my uncle, her brother. And it just gets, it's like, it's like shit rolls downhill. It just does, you know? And so while we think we're doing better, or what we're doing is the right thing, we're not always doing the right thing, or we don't, it might not be the right thing for them, right? For the child. We're just doing the very best that we can. And so with that, I have compassion for my mom and I forgive her because I know that she was doing the best that she could with where she was in life and who she was, right? There's a famous quote that says, do what you can with what you got with where you are. It's one of the best quotes. I read it years ago from a book called Leveraging the Universe. It's one of my favorite all-time books. I think I've read it more than any other book. And it has never, ever left me. And I know that she was doing the very best that she could with where she was and what she had then. And I know that everything that I did was always the best that I could. And that's the exact thing I tell my son. I tell my kids, I say, give it your all. Give life 100%. Give everything you have. But know that every day that all you have is going to look different. There are going to be days that getting out of bed is all you can do. It's all you have in you, but you got out of bed. And then there's going to be days that you conquer the world. You get everything done. You feel amazing. You persevered. But every day you wake up and say, I'm going to give it all I have. I'm going to give everything I have and know that that's enough. And I know that I have done that in this life. I know that I did that with my kids. And I'd like to say that I have no regrets. There are moments when I wonder what would have happened had I had chosen to stay in San Diego. There is a weird burden. Oh, I can't believe I'm about to admit this on this podcast. There is a weird burden that I have carried for years that I feel responsible for the death of my father and the death of my grandmother, because I know without a shadow of a doubt that when I chose myself and I left California and I said, I'm going to go live my life without you two in my everyday energy, that I ended 2 soul contracts. My grandmother died within 2 months of me moving. My dad within 2 years. And while I know with everything in me that, and from everything that I've channeled over and over again, that our soul chooses when to exit, our life can never be taken from us, even if it looks like murder, suicide, illness, freak accident. Nothing is ever taken from us. On a soul level, our soul chose that it was done with this life, and it found the path of least resistance to exit its vessel. So I know that without a shadow of doubt. But my human self, my inner children, there is an inner child, or a couple of them probably, that believes that if I had stayed in San Diego, that they would still be alive. And I have not been able to set that down yet. It's not as strong as it used to be, or I'd be in a mush of tears right now. But it is still there. But at that moment in time, when I made the choice, it was the best that I could do. I was a woman who was desperate to feel loved. I was a woman who was desperate to be wanted, chosen, who had romanticized this life that I thought I was going to have if I moved. And when I moved, 2 months into that move, I knew that I had made a really big mistake. But I had already walked away from my alimony, a job that was making me a ridiculous amount of money. I had sold everything I owned but what I could fit in my car, and changed everybody's life. I wasn't going to turn around with my tail tucked and go back and say, oopsie, made a mistake. And I think what would have happened had I done that would have happened if I hadn't gone. But here's what I know for sure. I wouldn't be who I am today. And while this journey has been excruciatingly painful at times and deeply devastating and lonely at times, it's also allowed me to heal some of my deepest wounds. It's allowed me to help other people evolve on their journey, to break patterns and cycles. It's helped people to believe in themselves. It's helped people to go on to make beautiful businesses. It's helped people step into their power. And so I know it was never for nothing. But every decision I made created a new reality for me. Every decision you make places you in a new timeline, especially when they are life-altering decisions. Like, do I stay or do I move? Do I have this child or do I not? Do I take this opportunity or do I don't? Do I enter into this relationship or do I not? Do I leave this relationship or do I not? Those types of life-altering decisions create new worlds, new timelines. And sometimes the mind gets the best of us with wondering with what if. But in these moments when we make these decisions, we're making the decision with the self-awareness that we have at the time. And nothing is ever wrong, and there's never real failure, because failure is simply learning a lesson that hopefully will become wisdom and be the foundation that you step upon so that you don't make the mistake again, so that you don't have to repeat the lesson or experience the failure again. But sometimes we do, right? Sometimes we do. I've kind of gone a little bit all over the place, and that's okay. But I do want to say that if you are a mom out there who has a daughter or a son or a child that's on no contact with you, I hear you, I see you, and I'm sending you love. And the only thing that we can do when we have a child that wants to be no contact is to love them from afar, is to respect them enough to honor their decision. It doesn't mean that you stop loving them. It doesn't mean that you stop having worries about them or that you miss them, especially if you have grandchildren. But when our children become adults, they don't owe us anything and we don't owe them anything. And that's just a fact. And our relationship changes. And as grown-ass adults, our job is to respect another person's wishes. And if we can't, that's on us. And so as hard as today is because it's her birthday, I did reach out to her. I did say, happy birthday, I love you. And I don't expect a response, but I still wanted her to know that I was thinking about her. And that's it. I'm not going to push on her. I'm not going to blow her up. I'm not going to guilt her. I'm not, because she's allowed to be where she is. She's allowed to go through the process that she needs to go through. And I can just only hope that one day her perception will change. And as she heals and as she grows and as she evolves, it will. And I know that because as I grow, as I heal, as I evolve, my perception changes. Because again, we perceive the world as we perceive ourselves. And so I know that as I change, I see things differently. Because believing is seeing. Always, every day. I've been healing this abandonment wound for consciously since 2016. That's 8 years. It's a lot of layers. And I am in a much better place than I've ever been in my entire life. But to tell you that that wound still isn't triggered would be a complete lie, because it does. I'm just really adept to processing it and allowing myself to feel it and allowing myself to be there. And also knowing that none of it is real. It is a feeling based upon a programming that someone else convinced me of. Even if it's true that she didn't want me and that she didn't want to be a mother, it has nothing to do with my worth. It has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with her. And her leaving at 3 had nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with her. It had nothing to do with my worth. But somewhere along the way, there was a program installed that it was my fault. I was the problem, that she left because I wasn't enough or because I was too much. And I know this is the truth. And so when I see my daughter having these moments, I know that in her, she is probably feeling like she wasn't enough for me to stay, or that her brother wasn't enough for me to stay. That I'm sure that is her thought process. I'm sure she is battling with her own self-worth. That I made sure she always knew she was more than enough. I made sure my kids always knew their worth. But again, I promise you, we can do everything we can, and people will still develop trauma. People will still develop a program. People will still have their own perception. There's so many outside factors. Some things, it just takes a whole lineage to heal. And this is very obvious. It's going to take my whole lineage to heal this. And that's okay. It's okay. But I know that because I can hold this truth, because I can see this truth, because I've reached this point, this truth is available for her to access when and if she ever gets ready to. When she does her own self-healing work, she may end up having the same perception too, where she sees that my actions and my choices were about me and only me and had nothing to do with my kids. The same way that I can see that my parents' actions had nothing to do with me and were all about them, though we all were a part of the carnage. My kids were too. All we can do is have compassion and do our best to forgive ourselves. And I always tell people, who are parents, and some people who aren't parents, because if you've never been a parent, if you've never had your own child, there's things that you will never understand. And being a parent is like walking a fucking tightrope. It just is. It's one of the hardest things that you will ever do in this life. And no matter how hard you try, you're going to fuck it up. Because we're not perfect and we're learning. And that's okay. It's a beautiful thing. And I always come back to the thing that the guides have told me. We choose our parents, which I had the hardest time with, to be honest, when they started channeling this through me, because I was like, why would I choose this? But when we understand we're born into the exact opposite circumstances of that in which we are meant to go towards, it makes sense. You have to pick the people and the ingredients that are going to create the circumstance that is the opposite of that in which you're meant to go towards. So I picked people who didn't choose me. I picked people who abandoned me, who abused me and those things, so that I would go towards choosing myself and not abusing myself. Choosing me, cherishing me, appreciating me, having boundaries, doing what's best for me instead of people pleasing, which is self-abandonment. And instead of taking on everyone else's problems, instead of being everyone else's rescuer, and abusing myself by drinking and eating and smoking and bad relationships and bad decisions. I did that for years. So when you start to choose yourself, you stop becoming a people pleaser. You don't give two fucks what anybody else thinks. You don't worry about other people's judgment of you. You free yourself. You can dance in the middle of the street for all you care in front of a whole parade of people. I take videos of myself in the airport. I dance in the middle of random places. I just don't care. Because whatever someone else thinks of me has nothing to do with me. You free yourself. You start saying no to people when you don't want to do something or when you don't want to go somewhere. If you don't want to drink, you don't drink. Instead of eating or drinking or binge watching or binge scrolling or jumping into another relationship, you stop doing toxic, abusive things to yourself to avoid feeling what you don't want to feel. You feel it. You sit in it. You support yourself. You become your own ride or die. That's the process of healing the abandonment wound. You stop abandoning yourself. You stop abusing yourself. And I hope and pray that she gets there one day, but that's her journey to take. I spent my years of trying to teach people and show them where they were screwing up. Even today, when I hear friends who are venting to me, I can see their patterns. I can see their perception. I can see how their perception is skewed. I can see something that maybe they can't, but unless they've asked me to interfere, I have to let them walk their path. It's not my job to fix anybody else. My only job is to honor myself and to be there for someone if they need me to be, and I feel like I have the capacity to be there for them. And that's it. And so I hope that this reaches the people that really needed to hear this podcast today, because I know there's a lot of women out there, mothers that are experiencing no contact with their child. I know there's a lot of women out there that are under no contact with their parents. And we don't need to shame them by saying your parents are going to die soon or blah, blah, blah. Like, no, that's not necessary. We need to let people be where they are. We need to honor their decisions, even if it hurts. It's their decision and we can't change it. So we love them from afar. We love ourselves through it. And we know we're doing the very best that we can. We take responsibility for things that we need to take responsibility for. And we allow them to be where they need to be. And know that it will work itself out the way that it needs to. And with that, I will see you guys in the next episode. Hey, thanks for listening. This episode was brought to you by JohannaBurkhardt.com, where it's time to defy the limits of your mind and step into your multidimensional mastery. Don't forget to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. See you next time.